My name is Jessica Baker. I'm 29 years old. Yesterday, the same parents who left me and my little brother behind when I was just 14 suddenly showed up at my uncle's funeral, dressed in black, pretending to mourn. But I could see it in their eyes. They weren't there for him or for me. And in that moment, I knew something explosive was about to happen. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Hit like and subscribe, because this story will make you question what family really means. I grew up in Detroit in a house where the roof sagged like a tired back and leaked whenever the sky had opinions. We kept a cracked Rubbermaid bin in the hallway to catch the drips. In winter, the water froze in a lace along the ceiling, and the space heater hummed so loud it felt like a third resident. The kitchen belonged to the cockroaches. They nested behind the dented fridge and scurried when the light flicked on, little commas punctuating the linoleum. My father, Ray, worked construction when the jobs came through, carpentry in Grosse Pointe, drywall on half-renovated bungalows along Gresham. His hands were permanently dusty, nails rimmed in gray, knuckles scabbed. On Fridays, a paper envelope would land heavy on the table. By Saturday night, it would be thin as a prayer card. Northville Downs 8R rent money one trifecta at a time. He kept racing forms folded in his back pocket. The corners softened the way other men wore photos of their kids. If a horse was due, Ray believed like it was gospel. The radio muttered odds while he shaved. He said winners were all about instinct and timing. He never mentioned the car note or the overdue DTE bill when he left. My mother, Sandra, chased a life she could rent by the hour. She brought home handbags with logos that bled at the seams and perfume that smelled like sugar and rubbing alcohol. I could have been a model if it weren't for you and your brother, she liked to say, tugging a knockoff zipper that snagged. She knew how to tilt her chin to the fluorescent light in the bathroom so her face looked more expensive. She could turn $40 into 3 tops from the flea market on Dequindre and call it a bargain. She ironed brand labels onto thrift store jeans, then scolded me for not knowing how to be presentable. Danny was 11 the year I started counting his inhalations. He was all elbows and apology, with eyes that watered each time the cold came through the gaps in the window frames. When his chest tightened, I'd set up the nebulizer on the wobbly kitchen table. Plug in the compressor, measure the albuterol with the steadiness I wished I felt, screw the cap, fit the mask. Slow breaths, like blowing out birthday candles in your head, I'd whisper. We counted Mississippis, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, until the medicine fogged the plastic and his shoulders stopped hiking toward his ears. The machine's rattle was ugly, but it was the ugliest sound I loved. On the hungrier weeks, I cut his sandwich into 4 perfect squares, then spread them out on a plate so it looked like more. 2 slices of bologna became 4. Half an apple became a crown of wedges. I learned to stretch everything: water in the ketchup bottle, milk beneath a layer of powdered creamer, soup with an extra cup of tap. I tucked the biggest square of sandwich into the top right of his plate because he liked to save it for last, the way some kids save dessert. School felt like theater. I was the girl with the safety pin backpack and bleach-smelling hoodie who knew where the free lunch line started and which lunch lady would look the other way if you asked for an extra milk. I joined the library club because it stayed warm until 4 and nobody asked why you lingered there. The librarian let me check out books on asthma and roof repair and how to cook with pantry staples. I highlighted pages in my head and went home to improvise. Danny liked when I read to him from anything with pictures, even if the pictures were of lungs. Detroit taught me inventory. Which corner store on Verner sold eggs cheaper? Which bus ran more reliably on snowy mornings? Which neighbor would trade a Saturday of cleaning her porch for a ride to the clinic? I babysat the Hernandez kids, swept Mr. Lewis's steps, and sorted coupons like they were flashcards for survival. Once, I found a 20 in the pocket of a donated coat at church and stood on the sidewalk with it in my palm, guilty and relieved, the way you feel when a fever finally breaks. At night, our block sounded like a radio turning past stations, some laughter, some arguing, the occasional pop that made the alley dogs howl. I learned to move quietly, to stack bills in order of importance on the back of a chipped plate, to hide the cash from Ray's sure-thing weekends. He'd call from the payphone at the Coney Island near 8 Mile, voice buoyant, promising that this time he had the right box exacta and we'd be caught up by Monday. Sandra wasn't all bad. She could do a perfect cat-eye with a wobbly hand on a city bus. She taught me how to sew a button so it sat flat and how to walk fast without looking like you were running. But her mirror always seemed to come before our medicine. When Danny wheezed and we were out of refills, she'd sigh at the insurance line and whisper that if she had that runway life, none of this would happen. I stopped asking her for school field trip money and started volunteering to help chaperone instead. They waived the fee if you passed out granola bars and kept kids from wandering. Some Saturdays, when Ray actually worked and brought home donuts dusted with sugar, we pretended to be ordinary. I'd warm them in the oven, patchy as it was, and pour coffee that tasted faintly like last night's onions. Danny would draw superheroes with inhalers, capes made out of pillowcases, and I'd tape them to the fridge with the good tape so the roaches didn't crawl behind the edges. Once, the ceiling over the tub gave way in a soft crumble, drywall flaking onto my shoulders while I shampooed Danny's hair. I yanked him out, wrapped him in a threadbare towel, and dragged the bucket from the hallway to the bathroom. "It's okay," I told him, even as I imagined mold curling like question marks we couldn't answer. He nodded, trusting me because I was the one who knew where the duct tape lived and which corner of the mattress wasn't sagging. I circled payday Fridays and marked Danny's clinic appointments with a star. When the city's shut-off notice came, with its stern black font and the date that felt like a dare, I made a plan. Call, plead, negotiate a payment plan, bake a pan of cornbread from the box mix to celebrate a grace period like it was a holiday. I wasn't anyone's mother, not officially, not on paper. But when you're the person who knows the inhaler schedule, who rations the cereal, who keeps the half-broken world from collapsing in on a boy with soft lungs and gentler eyes, titles become irrelevant. Uncle James first appeared when I was 12. The winter our power kept flickering like a bad promise. I remember the sound of tires hissing on slush and the glow of sleek headlights sliding across our peeling living room wall. A car too quiet to be anything from our block idled at the curb, the kind of car you see in commercials between luxury watches and vacations nobody you know takes. Later I learned to say the word with a straight face, Tesla, but that night it felt like a spaceship landing outside a house. Ray opened the door with the chain still on, like the visitor might be a mistake. "Jimmy," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle. I had never heard my father use that tone, not even when he lost 3 weeks' pay at the Trek. The man on our stoop wore a dark suit that looked expensive even in the porch light's jaundiced glow. He wasn't big, not like Dad, but there was a steadiness to him, a way he took up space without noise. He smelled like clean air and something metal. He looked into me, straight and still, with a completely confident gaze that made me stand up a little taller without meaning to. "Jessica," he said, and my name sounded cared for. "I'm James." He nodded toward the kitchen where Danny was coloring at the table, tongue peeking out in concentration. "And that's your brother." Ray unhooked the chain. "We're busy," he muttered, though we weren't. The TV was off because the power had blinked again, and the space heater coughed like a smoker. Sandra adjusted her robe and smoothed her hair, the way she did before the mirror. She smiled with her lips and not her eyes. "You should call before you just show up," she said, but she stepped aside. Uncle James didn't bother with small talk. He took in the room, the buckets catching drips from the ceiling, the taped-up window, the nebulizer parts drying on a dish towel. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, then released. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which made Sandra almost laugh. But nobody like him was ever in the neighborhood. He set a canvas tote on the table next to Danny's crayons. "A few things," he said. For me, he pulled out a book with a bright yellow spine, women in lab coats, goggles pushed up, names I didn't yet know, hidden figures, and stubborn minds. He tapped the cover with 2 fingers. "You remind me of your grandmother, Jessica. She always fought for her place in life," he said. The sentence slipped into me like a key turning. For Danny, he lifted a wooden box of paints, the kind with real tubes and a palette you hold in your hand, not the chalky cakes from the dollar store. Danny's eyes widened, then cut to Ray, checking for permission to be excited. "Say thank you," Sandra prompted, already peeking into the tote as if more might appear. We could use a little help with. James's eyes moved to her, not unkind, but immovable, like a door you don't push without knocking. These are for them, he said. He turned back to me. I run a cybersecurity company. We build systems that keep people safe, banks, hospitals, schools. Lots of math. Lots of patterns. You like patterns? I nodded, hugging the book so hard my knuckles went white. I did like patterns. I kept them in my head to survive bus schedules, coupon cycles, the way Danny's breathing changed seconds before his chest tightened. Ray shifted his weight. Fancy suits, fancy words. You always did. His smile was flat. The brothers were mirrors that didn't reflect each other. Same eyes, but different weather behind them. James didn't engage. He crouched beside Danny. May I sit? He waited until Danny nodded, then twisted open a tube of ultramarine blue like he had done it 100 times. Try this. Real pigment. Slow, steady pressure. It's more paint than you think. He held Danny's gaze the whole time, not his hands, letting the boy own the motion. Art is breathing, he said softly. In and out. No rush. Danny looked up at me, proud and a little scared, like joy might be a fragile contraband. I squeezed his shoulder. You're good, I said, and meant it. Sandra drifted closer to the window to stare at the car. What do you even need a thing like that for? We can barely keep the lights on, and you're out there saving banks. She said it like a joke, but the edge was sharp. Because it works, James said simply. Silent. Efficient. He straightened, hands in his coat pockets. And I like to be where I say I'll be on time. He didn't stay long. Maybe 20 minutes. He listened more than he talked, and when he talked, it was to us, not over us. He asked what I liked in school, the library, the parts where the room was warm, whether Danny's chest felt tight more in the mornings or at night, mornings, always, and which bus stop was closest, the one with the busted bench by the laundromat. He didn't write anything down, but I had the sense of someone collecting data he wouldn't misplace. When he left, he shook Ray's hand, a formal gesture that felt like a boundary drawn with a ruler. I'll stop by again, he said, and for a second I believed him the way you believe in weather reports when the clouds already look the part. We watched from the doorway as the Tesla glided away, red taillights small as pinpricks. The house seemed louder once the quiet left. Ray scratched his neck and grunted, show off, but his voice lacked heat. Sandra slid her fingers along the book's cover like it might peel into cash. Cybersecurity, she repeated, savoring the syllables as if they were edible. On my 14th birthday, my parents announced we were going on a visit. No cake, no candles, just a plastic bag each and orders not to ask questions. Sandra set a lipstick-red smile that didn't touch her eyes, and Ray kept jingling his keys like a man who'd made up his mind. Danny clutched his inhaler the way other kids held stuffed animals. It's a surprise, Mom said, folding 2 shirts I hated into the bag as if this were a vacation. I packed the nebulizer parts, a paperback, and the photo of us at Belle Isle, the one where Danny's hair stuck up like a dandelion. The drive took us south along I-75, past billboards for fireworks and outlet malls, past smokestacks and flat fields still winter brown. Ray hummed along to the sports station and missed 2 exits without apologizing. Sandra spritzed perfume until the car smelled like vanilla and nerves. When I asked where we were going, Ray said, a friend. When I asked which friend, he said, you'll see. Every mile felt like a secret pushed deeper under a rug. We reached a subdivision outside Toledo where houses looked copied and pasted, beige after beige, with cheerful porch flags and mailboxes shaped like loons. A woman was waiting on a driveway lined with solar lights. She wore leggings, a cozy cardigan, and the kind of sincere smile that tried too hard. You must be Jessica and Danny, she said. I'm Marcia. Old friend of your mom and dad. She hugged me like she had the right. The house behind her had a wreath made of faux lemons, the kind that tried to look like welcome. Inside, everything was soft and curated. Throw pillows with words like gather and blessed leaned against a beige sectional. The kitchen counters were pristine, a bowl of green apples placed just so. I watched Sandra clock the apples, the stainless steel fridge, the curated life not hers. We won't be long, Ray said, setting his keys on the counter, casual as a man dropping anchor. Just catching up. Marcia gave us a tour. Guest room. Backyard with a grill under a canvas cover. Danny ran his fingers along the slider door and asked if there were any pets. Not yet, Marcia chirped. Maybe someday. She made hot cocoa with real milk, topped with whipped cream spirals that made Danny's eyes go shiny. I drank mine too fast and burned my tongue because it felt rude to admit I didn't know how to be here. We ate pizza at a real dining table. Ray told a story about a foreman who didn't know a stud wall from a support beam and laughed like he was auditioning for Charm. Sandra asked for a glass of white wine and got two. They were affectionate with Marcia in a way they rarely were with us, touches on the elbow, a private language of glances. We're just stepping out to get groceries, Sandra said after dinner, slipping on her knockoff heels. Marcia's out of a few things. Groceries at night in a town we didn't know. I'll come, I offered. No need, Ray said. You kids stay. We'll be quick. The door shut with that suburban hush, the kind with weather stripping and no complaints. We waited. Marcia put on a movie where the parents solved every problem in 90 minutes. She paused it when Danny started to cough and fetched a humidifier from a closet like she was used to problem-solving the air. Your parents love you very much, she said, too brightly. I nodded because contradicting a stranger in her own home felt risky. Time stretched. The ceiling fan made gentle circles. The clock ticked with curated confidence. 10 o'clock became 11. Danny fell asleep curled under a buffalo check throw, fingers still bent around his inhaler. I stared at the door until midnight, convinced the knob would turn if I willed it hard enough. It didn't. Marcia brought me water and a soft, apologetic look. They probably had car trouble, she said. Maybe phones die. I woke to daylight and the lemon wreath framed by the window. The guest room smelled like laundry detergent with capital letters. Marcia was already up, hair clipped, cardigan tied. There's a note, she said, and placed an envelope in my hand as if it were part of her morning routine. My name in Sandra's slanted handwriting. Inside, one printer paper page, the words floating like oil on water. Jessica and Danny, you deserve better. Don't look for us. The sentence made a noise in my head, a glassy crack I felt in my teeth. I read it twice, then a third time, as if a different meaning would appear if I changed the rhythm. Don't look for us. As if this were mercy. As if this were a generous act. Danny patted in, hair flattened on one side, eyes swollen by sleep. Where's Mom? He asked. I folded the note so he wouldn't see the shape of the words. They're not here, I said. Marcia called someone. They left a note, she said into the phone, voice pitched between concern and vindication. No, I didn't think they'd actually. Yes. The kids are here. She offered us waffles with syrup while we waited. Danny ate one bite and stared at the squares like a map he couldn't read. I kept touching the envelope as if it might dissolve. Two women arrived with clipboards and calm voices that never rose. One wore a sweater with little birds stitched across the chest. I'm Angela, she said. This is Monique. We're from Children's Services. They asked questions with checkboxes, names, birthdays, allergies. Did we feel safe at home? Where was home? I answered like I was on a quiz I hadn't studied for. We'll make sure you're both cared for, Angela said, the words practiced, kindly distant. Marcia handed over our plastic bags like party favors we didn't want. They brought a spare backpack for each of us, a toothbrush still in plastic, socks folded like hotel mints. This is temporary, Monique said. We'll find a placement together if we can. The if landed like a stone. I looked at Danny and lied with my face the way grown-ups do. At the curb, the city looked freshly washed. The car smelled like lemon wipes and new beginnings that weren't ours. We spent the night in an emergency foster home with a woman who collected ceramic angels. Danny slept on a couch that folded into a bed, his arm reaching out as if it might catch something falling. In the morning, a different car came. Different agency logo. Different promise. There's not a joint placement available, the driver said without looking at me. We'll reunite you as soon as we can. Soon is a word that can mean anything. We had 5 minutes in a parking lot behind a brick building to say the shortest goodbye of our lives. I zipped Danny's jacket up to his chin and pressed the nebulizer tubing into his backpack so it wouldn't poke him. You breathe slow, I said, as if my instructions could travel through walls. Count Mississippis. His eyes went huge and wet. Where are you going? A shelter, I said. It's like a big sleepover with rules. It wasn't. His new foster mother, a woman with sensible shoes and kind, tired eyes, touched his shoulder. We'll take good care of him, she said, meaning it and not meaning me. They put him in the back seat, car seat belts crossing his chest like an X. He pressed his palm to the window, and I pressed mine to the other side, separated by clean glass and a system with numbers for names. His mouth formed a word I didn't hear. The car pulled away, and our lives tore like paper along a dotted line someone else had drawn. I stood there with the envelope in my pocket, a backpack of secondhand necessities on my shoulder, and a feeling I didn't have before. 2 weeks later, Uncle James walked into the shelter lobby like a storm holding itself together. His face was red with anger, jaw tight, tie knotted too precisely as if neatness could keep him from exploding. My brother did this? He abandoned you, he asked the caseworker, but his eyes were on me. He could barely contain himself. When he finally looked straight at me, the anger shifted to something steadier. You're coming with me, he said, not loud, just certain, and the certainty felt like heat after a long cold. He signed forms with a heavy black pen, asked calm questions no one had bothered to ask. What medications, what triggers, where my brother had been placed, whether I'd eaten. Then he put his hand at my back, not pushing, simply there, and guided me outside to the kind of car that glides more than drives. On the highway, he kept one hand on the wheel and the other calling people, words like petition, emergency placement, guardianship. Chicago, he said, as if it were a solution, not just a place. I watched the road unspool and tried not to count the miles between me and Danny. The house in Chicago had a huge terrace that made the sky look closer. The first time I stepped out there, the city sounded like it had its own ocean, a steady hush of traffic, a faraway train. My new bedroom was bigger than our entire apartment had been. The bed felt like a field. The closet held more hangers than I had shirts. At first, I hated it. The silence was too clean, the lights too obedient. The HVAC purred instead of clinking. No neighbors argued through thin walls. No bucket waited for ceiling drips. I slept in a corner of the giant bed, as if smallness were a rule I might break by mistake. I missed Danny with a physical pull, like my ribs had hooks attached to his name. I set his toothbrush on the bathroom counter anyway, just to see something of him there. James moved like a man with a plan he didn't intend to announce. He met with people in a glass-walled office at his company and with other people in rooms where the windows didn't open. He hired lawyers who wore navy and spoke without adjectives. They brought binders labeled with our names, dividers like small gates. They listened to my story without flinching and turned it into paperwork with the right verbs. We'll file for guardianship, one said. We'll request that the siblings be reunited. James nodded once, the kind of nod that made things move. I answered questions under fluorescent lights, what time of day Danny's breathing got worse, the names of our schools, the last time I'd seen Ray and Sandra. I learned to say parents, like a category, not a shelter. A social worker visited the house to see where a child would sleep. I showed her the room James and I had set up, a desk with real wood, a small shelf for paints, a comforter with bright blocks of color. I placed the paint set Uncle James had given years ago on the desk like a promise I kept dusting. Court was a room with gray carpet and clocks that ticked too loudly. I wore the least fancy clothes in the fancy city and tried to keep my hands still. The judge asked me to speak. My voice surprised me by being steady. I told her about counting Danny's breaths, about cutting sandwiches into fours, about the envelope with 6 words that rearranged our lives. James spoke very little, only to confirm he could provide and that he intended to. There were delays, because there are always delays. A missing form, a rescheduled hearing, a caseworker out sick. Each day stretched like old elastic. James bought me a winter coat that didn't let wind through and a pair of boots that made slush a smaller problem. He made me oatmeal in the mornings like he had always done it. At night, He sat with me on the terrace with 2 mugs of peppermint tea, steam ghosting up, and said, "We're not done." It was the only sentence I needed. The day the order came through, it arrived as an email and a call, legal words stacked like bricks, temporary guardianship granted, sibling reunification approved, placement to occur within 72 hours. James didn't smile big. His relief was a release of breath. We drove to the foster home with a backpack full of what we thought a boy might want: pajamas with rockets, a notebook, colored pencils, a hoodie soft enough to be a hug. I held the backpack in my lap like it was him. Danny came to the door cautious and hopeful, the way you approach a dog that might belong to you. He was taller, but still all elbows. When he saw James behind me, he straightened like someone had pulled a string inside him. I crouched to his height. "You're coming home," I said, and didn't care that home was a new word we were still building. He nodded so hard I worried he'd get dizzy. Back in Chicago, we gave him the grand tour like we were tour guides of a better universe. He ran from the kitchen to the terrace to his room and froze when he saw the paints on the desk. He touched the palette with 2 fingers the way you touch something sacred. That first night, we ate pizza off paper plates on the floor because the couch hadn't arrived yet, and it felt right. Danny fell asleep with his door open. James passed by, paused, and without touching the door, gave it a small nod, as if to bless it. The next morning, James laid 2 folders on the table, school enrollment forms and a simple document with 3 signatures, his, mine as acknowledgement, and a blank line waiting for Danny's scribble. "This just says I'm responsible for you," he told Danny. "For both of you." It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was oatmeal again, and a calendar pinned to the corkboard with court dates converted into dentist appointments, and a grocery list that included the cereal Danny liked. We didn't become a family all at once. We assembled it, piece by piece, with keys and forms and pizza grease and bedtime. But there was a morning, a few weeks later, when Danny grinned at a joke James made and called him UNC with a mouthful of cereal, and I realized the math had changed. We weren't visitors anymore. Somewhere between the shelter lobby and the terrace sky, we became his children. Private school felt like entering a different weather system. The hallways smelled like lemon polish and printer ink, not bleach and cafeteria grease. Girls wore blazers with crests and carried planners with color-coded tabs. I arrived with a public school backpack held together by safety pins and a habit of eating lunch fast, as if someone might take it away. James didn't hover. He introduced me to the dean, shook hands with the counselor, and quietly paid the bill that covered uniforms, books, even the lab fee I was too embarrassed to ask about. Then he found me a psychologist who didn't speak in riddles. Dr. Patel had warm eyes and a way of waiting me out until the truth climbed past my throat. We talked about alarms my body still carried. James treated business like a second language he fully expected me to become fluent in. On Mondays, he slid a thin stack of reports across the breakfast table: P&L, churn, NPS, terms I couldn't pronounce at first. "Skim, then circle what confuses you," he'd say. On Thursdays, he gave me tasks as if I were an employee. Build a pivot table that reveals which customers are about to cancel. Write a memo arguing for or against renewing a vendor. Sit in on a call and listen for what isn't being said. I learned that numbers have moods, that cash flow gets jumpy in Q3, that a perfect deck is useless if the client's gut says no. At night, he'd quiz me while we did dishes. "What's our gross margin on the legacy product?" I'd answer with rubber gloves on, steam fogging my glasses, and he'd nod like I belonged at the table. Danny, meanwhile, fell into art. James enrolled him in Saturday classes at the Art Institute and found a teacher who understood how to coddle talent without smothering it. Our terrace grew an easel and a canvas drop cloth. On summer nights, the city lights made his paints look electric. He moved from cartoons to portraits to landscapes, then back again, hunting the angle that made truth show its face. His asthma eased, his laugh came easier, and sometimes I would catch James watching him with the soft amazement of a man who cannot believe his home contains color he didn't have to earn. By 20, I had a badge at Baker Tech and an inbox that didn't care who I was after 5 p.m. I started in customer success, the unglamorous frontline where nothing about a business stays theoretical. I learned to translate engineering into English and fear into checklists. "You're not here to be the boss's niece," James told HR. "She's here to do the work." And I did. I took the 6 a.m. calls with clients in Boston and the 10 p.m. escalations from Bakersfield. I learned which engineers answered Slacks at midnight and which ones needed snacks left outside their door. At 23, after a year of compiling every complaint from every small business client we had, I pitched a new line built just for them: flat fee security, bite-sized support, plug-and-play compliance. No jargon. Transparent pricing. We launched in the spring with a webinar and a money-back guarantee. Word of mouth did the rest. Restaurants, clinics, dental offices, doggy daycares, whole corners of the city that had never considered themselves tech buyers signed up like we'd been waiting for them personally. The market didn't just respond, it roared. We hit targets that made the board blink. I hired and trained a scrappy team that worked like a relay race. One Friday, after I finished a call with a bakery whose credit card breach we had stopped cold, James stepped into my glass box of an office and rested his hand on the doorframe like he needed the architecture to hold him still. "Now you're not just my niece," he said, pride tucked into his even voice. "You're my partner." We didn't toast. We ordered tied to our desks and kept building. Then the blood work came back wrong. James was 52 when the word pancreatic entered our house like a new law. The doctors spoke carefully at the big hospital with the oatmeal-colored waiting room, using phrases like "less than a year" and "aggressive regimen." I sat with a notebook and wrote down everything, then went home and Googled the things they hadn't said out loud. He watched me with that calm, direct gaze and put his hand over mine. "No more late-night internet," he told me, a half-smile failing to cover his fear. "We'll listen to the people wearing the badges." He lived 2 years. 2 long, precise, stubborn years. He rearranged his calendar around infusions and boarded meetings from a recliner with a blanket over his knees. On good days, we walked the terrace, and he pointed at skyline cranes, telling me which buildings were backed by foolish money and which ones would last. On bad days, I brought the company to him: engineers with thorny problems, sales leads that smelled off, contracts that needed teeth. "Say no faster," he'd tell me when I hedged. "Make the other person name their price first when I rushed a deal. Hire for judgment, not resume," when I fell for shine. He rewrote more than his will. He rewired the business. He taught me to run Baker Tech without him while he was still here, falling asleep in the middle of strategy sessions and waking to finish my sentence. With Danny, he met weekly in a studio space he rented above a framing shop, critiquing gently, paying for canvas without comment, reminding him that real art keeps a ledger too. And in the quiet between appointments, he told us the only truth he ever wanted us to inherit: that the house, the company, the future, he was setting them up so my brother and I would have everything we needed to stand on our own. The cathedral sounded like winter when the doors closed, stones swallowing voices, heels tapping like distant rain. The stained glass pressed colored light onto the pews, and the organist, a silver-haired woman in navy, tested a hymn so softly it felt like a memory warming its hands. I stood near the front with my notes folded and unfolded until the edges softened, looking at the photo of James the ushers had placed beside the casket, that half-smile he wore when he'd already solved the problem and was waiting for me to catch up. People from Baker Tech filled the left side, engineers in dark suits, our first florist client with a corsage she'd made herself, the receptionist who had started bringing lemon cake to chemo days. Family was the word printed on the front row's programs like a reserved sign. When it was my turn to speak, my feet felt too loud walking up the steps. The lectern creaked, the microphone did that small electric cough. I could hear my breath expand in the nave. "My Uncle James didn't talk much," I began, voice narrower than usual. "He looked you in the eye, figured out what you needed, and quietly built a bridge under your feet." And halfway through, I saw them. Back row, just beneath a window of St. Joseph carrying lilies, stood Ray and Sandra, their heads close together, faces tilted with that solemn performance people think grief requires. Ray had shaved. Sandra wore black that still managed to glitter under church light. 15 years had thinned them, not softened them. They stood like shoppers, scanning for the register. The breath I held slipped and my paper trembled. I tightened my grip until the edges bit my palm and returned my gaze to the front, to James's photo, to the lilies that smelled faintly of hospitals. I finished without saying their names. The organist's hands became fuller, the sound rising like something knit. Danny reached for my hand as I stepped down, his paint-stained fingers sliding into my palm with the familiarity of our earliest years. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded, but the yes didn't reach my throat. When the recessional began, I felt the shift in the room, the clean closure ritual offers, people relieved to be told what to do, stand, sing, file out. We waited by the side aisle while the pallbearers moved. I kept my eyes on the priest's vestments, the stitched gold threads, anywhere but the back. But the back moved toward us. "Jessica," Sandra said, appearing first, voice pitched tender. Her lipstick was the wrong red for a burial. "Oh, honey." She reached for me with the same hands that had once folded 2 shirts into a plastic bag and called it a visit. Ray hovered a step behind, jacket too new, eyes wet in that glossy way liquor gives. "We came as soon as we heard," he said, like obituaries travel by telegram. "We're family. Our blood is more important than anything else." For a second I saw our kitchen, the cockroaches blinking in the light, the nebulizer steaming on the table, the envelope on Marcia's counter. 15 years collapsed and stood back up again. "You lost that right 15 years ago," I said, the words steady in a way my knees were not. Sandra's smile faltered, surprised that a door not hers to open had stayed shut. "Don't be cruel," she murmured, squeezing my forearms as if touch could edit history. "Your uncle wouldn't want." "You didn't know what my uncle wanted," I said, taking a small step back. "You never tried." Danny came to stand beside me, a quiet presence, shoulders square. I felt his breath sync with mine, the old rhythm we'd practiced in dark kitchens. Ray studied the carpet, then looked up with something like calculation. "Look," he said, softer. "This is hard on all of us. We should talk. Maybe over coffee. Set things right." I heard the capital letters in his head. Set things right? The kind of phrase people use when they mean set things for me. People were watching. The florist with the corsage had stopped fiddling with her clutch. James's COO shifted his weight like a man considering whether to step closer. The priest lingered by a pillar, pretending to study the hymn board. I thought about hiding, about letting politeness carry me until the moment passed. James's voice cut through the choir rehearsal in my head. "Say no faster." "No," I said. "Not today." Sandra's eyes glittered with a different light. She leaned in, dropped her voice to a confidential hiss. "We know things," she said. "About how he took you. About what he promised." Her breath smelled like mint and threat. I almost laughed. The cathedral did it for me, a stone echo the universe uses to remind you which rooms you're in. I squared my shoulders, the way James had told me to before investor meetings. Ray's mouth opened, shut. He straightened, tried on a paternal posture that no longer fit. "You'll regret this," he said, and the words sounded small in so much space. "Move along, please," the usher said gently from behind them, owning the sanctified power of a man with a pin on his lapel and a schedule to keep. Sandra flinched at being ushered. Danny's hand squeezed mine once. We stepped sideways, letting the procession of mourners flow. We stood in the doorway where cold air met incense and let the city pour back in. We followed James one last time, past the frozen river and the construction cranes he would have critiqued, to a cemetery where the ground wore a thin coat of frost like sugar. I placed my palm on the polished wood and closed my eyes. 3 days later, we gathered at the lawyer's office, a brick building with brass letters on the door and a lobby that smelled like lemon oil and old paper. The receptionist spoke in that funeral-appropriate hush and offered bottled water we forgot to open. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see the skyline pressed flat against February, all gray angles and a thin stripe of pale sun. James's photo, same half-smile from the funeral, rested on a credenza beside a vase of white tulips someone had sent with a card that read, simply Mentor. James's employees filled the long table, Nora, our COO, with a legal pad full of underlines, Evan from engineering, still wearing his conference badge like he'd come straight from a meeting, Marcy from HR, shoulders squared like she was bracing for impact. A few close associates sat near the end, our accountant, a board member whose hand briefly found mine in a small squeeze. Danny chose a chair next to me, sketchbook in his lap, pencil unmoving. The only people who looked at home were the two senior partners from Perkins and Bray, Mr. Holloway, gray hair and quiet eyes, and his associate, Lila, efficient even in her sorrow. Then the door opened to admit Ray and Sandra. They arrived with tense smiles, dressed in their interpretation of wealth adjacent. Ray's suit still had the temporary threads stretched across the vents. Sandra's black dress flashed sequins when she moved, the kind of shine that announces itself. They took in the room with quick, hungry glances, like shoppers clocking the jewelry case. Sandra's mouth softened into an expression that read benevolent and motherly to anyone who hadn't seen her fold a life into plastic bags. Ray nodded at the partners as if recognizing old colleagues. We hadn't seen them in 15 years, and yet, there they were on time for money. Mr. Holloway called us to order with a gentleness that didn't pretend to erase the stakes. "Thank you all for coming," he said, hands folded, voice warm but edged with procedure. James Baker entrusted our firm with his last will and testament. He also left additional materials to be presented today. We will proceed in sections. No one breathed. He began with the ordinary, bequests to a scholarship fund James had established for first-generation college students, a donation to the pediatric asthma clinic where Danny once learned to count his breaths. People murmured, nodded. This sounded like James, the man who thought in deeds. Then Mr. Holloway lifted a second folder, thinner and somehow heavier. He adjusted his glasses. To Ray and Sandra Baker, he read, his voice neither cruel nor kind, simply precise, "I leave $1 each, and this letter." Sandra's mouth fixed, then wobbled. Ray's jaw worked. They kept smiling, both of them, but the smiles became masks with bad elastic. "Excuse me," Sandra said, too bright. "Is that a joke?" She let out a laugh that made no sound. "It is not," Holloway said, and slid 2 envelopes across the table, addressed in James's blocky handwriting. "We have James's letter for each of you, and a copy to be read into the record." He unfolded a 3rd page and began to read. James's voice came off the paper so clearly I could hear his measured breaths between sentences. He didn't waste words. Like he never had. "Ray, Sandra, for 15 years, you have contacted me periodically to demand money for your silence," the letter began. "You threatened to accuse me of kidnapping Jessica and Daniel unless I paid. You asked for cash, preloaded cards, gift cards, wire transfers, and loans with no intent to repay. You did this while the children slept in my home and called it safety." Sandra blanched. "That is slander," she snapped, turning to the room for support she did not find. "We never." "Please let me finish," Holloway said, calm as the seal on a document. James continues. He read on. Dates, times, amounts. Cities listed like stops on a bus route. I documented your calls. I kept your letters. I recorded the threats. You said you would go to the police and tell the news that I had stolen my niece and nephew. You said you would show up at their schools. You said you would take the children away. I paid at first to protect them from you. Then I went to the authorities. A quiet like a chapel descended. In my chest, something unclenched and cried at once. The letters. The recordings. The truth rendered in ink. Lila slid a small remote to Holloway. He pressed a button. A screen at the end of the room, one we used for quarterly metrics and product demos, glowed blue and then resolved into video, time-stamped, framed by the living room we had once loved when the world was simple. The one we'd later redesigned for infusion chairs and soft blankets. Ray's face filled the screen, soft at the edges from drink, eyes glassy with zeal. He swayed slightly. 100 grand, he slurred, pointing at the camera like it owed him. You got it. I know you got it. You think you're a hero? You think you can just walk in and buy my kids? He smiled, a broad, ugly thing. Pay up, Jimmy. Or the police hear you took M. The room's oxygen thinned. The video cut to another clip. Sandra, composed but vibrating, stared into the lens from a booth at a diner I recognized by its napkin dispensers. You listen to me, she said, voice sugar over steel. You either wire 50 by Friday, or we come for the children. They belong to us. Blood is blood. You won't like what happens if we have to take them. Evan swore under his breath. Marcy's hand flew to her mouth. Nora's pen stopped moving. Danny's pencil snapped. My own hands went calmly cold, the way they did before big presentations, except this was no boardroom. Holloway paused the video and scanned the table. We have dozens of such recordings, he said quietly. James also preserved voicemails, text messages, and letters. He tapped the folder. This material has been in federal custody for several months. Sandra pushed back her chair, metal scraping. This is staged, she announced, jaw set. Deep fakes. You people and your computers, you can make anything say anything. She pointed at the screen as if the pixels might confess. James is not here to confirm. This is character assassination. It's not assassination if the target aimed first, Nora said, eyes dry as dust. Ray leaned forward, trying a new angle. We were desperate, he said, lower now, coaxing. The kids were taken from us. We just wanted help. Family help. He swung to the table like a salesman at a doomed pitch. We were going to pay it back. Things got out of hand. No, I said before I knew I was speaking. The word landed like a knuckle on a door. You left us with a note that said not to look for you. You only ever looked for us when James had something you wanted. Holloway nodded to Lila. She pressed another button. The video resumed, this time a montage of email scans, return addresses with Ray's and Sandra's names spelled correctly and incorrectly, demands dressed as please, threats dressed as principal. Each contained the same vertebrae, pay or we expose the lie we invented. The door at the back of the conference room opened. 2 agents entered, crisp in navy windbreakers, gold letters at the breast, FBI. The room instinctively pulled in a breath. The lead agent, a woman with dark hair pulled into a low knot, flashed a badge with the weary courtesy of someone long past theatrics. Raymond Baker? Sandra Baker, she asked, though it was not a question. We have federal warrants for your arrest. Sandra straightened, indignation blooming. On what grounds? She demanded, chin tilting. We are grieving parents. The agent kept her voice even. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and interstate extortion, she said, reading off like a grocery list of choices made and mailed. There are also state charges in Michigan and Ohio for schemes to defraud vulnerable adults. You have the right to remain silent. Ray did not remain silent. This is ridiculous, he barked, half rising. The second agent, broad shoulders, careful hands, stepped closer without heat. Sir, he said, gentle in a way that contained steel. Please stand and place your hands behind your back. The room dissolved into the kind of silence that amplifies everything it contains. The minute click of Lila capping her pen, the unzipping whisper of a cuff case. I sat very still, back straight, palms flat on the table, and watched without blinking as the past we had survived met consequences in the present tense. They cuffed Ray first. He looked smaller from the shoulders down, like his anger had been a kind of posture. Sandra pulled back, eyes wide like a child's. Jessica, she called, my name suddenly a plea. Tell them we're family. Family is not a subpoena, Nora muttered. I kept my voice even. I already spoke, I said. At the funeral. The lead agent nodded at Holloway, who handed her a thin stack of papers, copies of the materials James had assembled and sent months ago. The agent slid them into a folder, efficient. You'll be processed downtown, she told Ray and Sandra. You can make your calls there. As they were guided toward the door, Sandra glanced at Danny. For a second, her face cracked into something like surprise, as if she were seeing him for the first time since he'd been 11, mask strapped to his small face, counting Mississippis while the nebulizer rattled. He didn't look away. His eyes were steady. When the door closed behind them, there was no applause, no TV drama release of breath, just the soft aftersound of a room recalibrating to a new truth. Holloway turned off the screen and folded his hands again. James asked that the rest of his will be discussed after this matter, he said. He believed clarity should come before generosity. We sat a long while without speaking. Someone finally cracked a water bottle, another cleared their throat. When Holloway resumed, he looked at me, then at Danny. "Shall we continue?" he asked. I placed my palm on the table to study the room that seemed to tilt. "Yes," I said. My voice surprised me by holding. "Let's finish what he started." The reading of the will ended with a silence so deep that I could hear my own breathing. The lawyer's voice steadied as he turned the page. "To Jessica and Daniel Baker, my niece and nephew whom I consider my children, I leave the entirety of my estate, my company shares, properties, and personal assets." He paused. "And this letter." The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read James's words aloud. "Jessica and Danny, I wanted you to know the truth. You were never the reason your parents left. You were never a burden. If I could change anything, it would only be to have had more time to raise you both. You were my greatest pride, and I was honored to be your father." The words split something inside me wide open. I had held myself together for weeks, through the hospital visits, through the funeral, through the confrontation with Ray and Sandra. But hearing that final line, "I was honored to be your father," broke me in a way that also rebuilt me. I felt Danny's hand squeeze mine under the table, silent tears streaming down his face. For the first time, neither of us questioned whether we were enough. The estate was enormous, shares of Baker Tech, multiple properties in Chicago and beyond, investments I couldn't even fully grasp yet. But the wealth didn't matter as much as the responsibility it carried. James hadn't just left us riches, he had left us a mission. He wanted us to live, to continue, and to make something greater than survival. That's how the Baker House Foundation was born. Danny and I worked side by side, turning grief into structure. We rented an office in a modest brick building, hired a small staff, and created a mission statement rooted in the very wound we carried, to help children who had been separated from their siblings in foster care. It was my idea to call it Baker House, not just for the family name, but because the word house mattered. We had known what it was like to lose ours, to feel unmoored. The opening day of the foundation felt heavier than any business launch I had ever done. There was no market to conquer, no competitors to outmaneuver, only children with eyes too old for their faces and foster parents trying to stitch families back together with limited resources. During the ceremony, a girl approached me. She was about 12, hair pulled back too tightly, her oversized sweatshirt hanging off narrow shoulders. She tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Your foundation helped me see my brother again." Her voice was small, but her eyes, big, dark, unblinking, carried the same mixture of hope and fear I had once seen in the mirror at her age. I bent down so we were eye level. "What's his name?" I asked. "Eli," she said, and for a moment, her face softened. "He's only 9. They wanted to send him far away, but the foundation, they found a way to keep us close." I hugged her before I could stop myself. It wasn't professional, it wasn't planned, but it was human. And in that instant, I saw myself again, the 14-year-old girl left behind in Toledo, clutching Danny's hand, trying to be both mother and sister before I even understood who I was. James's money had given us security, but his letter gave us purpose. The foundation wasn't charity, it was redemption. Every reunion we arranged, every sibling who didn't have to cry into a pillow alone at night, felt like James's hand reaching out from beyond, still building, still protecting. Danny once asked me if I ever wished things had been different, if our parents had stayed. I looked at him for a long time before answering. If they had stayed, maybe we wouldn't have met the real parent we were meant to have. James's true legacy was never the millions, the company shares, or the houses with terraces that stretched toward the sky. His real gift was the truth he carved into us, that family is not defined by blood, but by presence. When I look back, I realize he taught me lessons more valuable than any inheritance. He showed me that survival is not enough, that we are meant to build, to give back, to protect those who cannot yet protect themselves. So when I meet children through the Baker House Foundation, when I see brothers and sisters holding hands after months apart, I think of James. I think of how he turned two abandoned kids into a family, and how, in his absence, he still manages to stitch broken bonds back together. That is legacy. Not wealth. Not titles. But the people whose lives are changed because you were there. And now I want to turn to you. Have you ever felt like an unwanted child, forgotten until you had value to offer? Share your own story with me in the comments below, because I believe speaking the truth heals more than silence ever will. Hit that like and subscribe button if this story made you think about what family really means.